We are live. Welcome, 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 Liberty lovers. It is Election Day 2020. This is Matthew Struck with Why Libertarian. Today, this is our live cast. It's our normal time slot, but luckily enough, we chose Tuesday evening. So that means that every single election season, you'll see us Tuesday evenings. I will not be going all evening, but we do have a lot to go over. So really quickly, leading into tonight, obviously, we have kind of a strange election going on. I want to focus on a little bit on the Libertarian candidates, but a lot of it's going to be on the presidential race. A lot of the down ticket stuff does get determined by how the presidential race runs. So really quickly, before we get rolling, if you're watching this live, you can comment, ask questions, give your feedback. I can look at comments real time and answer if you have anything that comes to mind. Also, whether you're watching live or you watch this recording later, please give it a like, follow, subscribe, hit the notification bell, tweet, retweet. It would really help me to put this out there and get some more people interested in liberty, freedom, and the Why Libertarian channel. And definitely check out a lot of the other interviews and things like that we do. Actually threw one up last week with Larry Sharp. Absolutely fantastic interview on the YouTube channel if you check it out. So really quickly, before we get into the presidential race, I'm celebrating a little bit on election night, a little Tennessee honey. I'm definitely a whiskey guy, and there's a little sweetness added in there because we're not going hard this evening, at least not until later in the evening, depending on what the results of the election are. And I don't even know if we're actually going to end up knowing what the final results are tonight. It might take a couple of these swing states about a week for us to figure out what the final lay of the land is, unless we end up with a landslide one way or another. So that being said, before we get into the POTUS discussion, let's just talk really quickly about the Libertarian candidates that are running down ticket races. The two big ones I wanted to highlight were Ricky Dale Harrington over in Arkansas running for the Senate seat. He's been polling pretty consistently, depending on the poll that you look at in between 10 and like 40% in that race. He does have a really good shot if folks turn out, especially if folks don't turn out for the Republicans in that race. He's basically running against, the Republican incumbent, unopposed. And so, he really needs a big turnout for the Libertarian side. And if the Republicans fall flat tonight, I think that's a good shot for Ricky Dale Harrington. Regardless, any of these races, if Libertarians end up picking up a large percentage within these races, it sends a message, right? It sends a message to the incumbents or the main parties that are in power in those areas, and it sends a message that folks are desperate for some other kind of political perspective other than the really authoritarian perspective that the Republicans and the Democrats kind of bring to the table pretty consistently now. All right. So that's Ricky. Ricky's a fantastic candidate. If you haven't watched the debate that he did on, I think it was PBS out there in Arkansas, definitely look it up, Google it. Ricky did a fantastic job. It was just him for an hour, which was awesome. And you'll love him. He's a fantastic, down-to-earth, really heartfelt candidate. You'll love him. The other one is Donald Rainwater over in Indiana. I believe that is a three-way race. I could be wrong, but that's for the governor's spot. He's been polling pretty consistently in the double digits. And again, maybe not. I'm not sure this is a winnable race necessarily for him. I'm hoping, I'm knocking on wood. But really, at the end of the day, even if it's just a large percentage of votes go his way, it sets the table for his next run, if that's governor or if that's, another position. And it also sends a message to the establishment parties that, the voters really are desperate for something new in terms of political perspective. All right. So that's enough. We'll talk about Joe Jorgensen and Spike Cohen here when we get into the presidential stuff. So let's talk about just kind of background. All right. Some like 30,000 feet in the air perspective here. All right. The polls right now, obviously, if you haven't been living under a rock, the polls nationally are favoring Biden. All right. One thing I would caution there is, first of all, they're completely skewed. Okay. The popular vote, I think it's a pretty easy prediction in this race. Popular vote's going to Biden. It's just going to Biden. Okay. The popular vote is dominated by New York City, LA, Chicago, and a handful of other communities that are urban communities, Democrat centers throughout this country. It's part of the reason why we have an electoral college, which, by the way, if Trump wins, brace yourselves. There's going to be all kinds of hemming and hawing about getting rid of the electoral college. In fact, they might try and do it if Biden wins as well and the Democrats have control of the Senate. They will try and stack the deck in their favor for the next who knows how many elections. Again, pure democracy and the tyranny of the majority is not something that our founders ever wanted, and it's not something that you want to see in this country. It's very important that we fight back against any narrative that tries to get rid of the electoral college. But so that being said, the polls themselves, what you really want to focus on are the poll results within the swing states, those states that are not bastions of Republicans and Democrats, the states that might actually flip between one or the other candidate, one or the other major party candidates. All right. I've looked at the math on a number of these. Here's good news for the Trump side. If you're a Trump voter, if you're a libertarian in a swing state who said, you know what, I want to vote for Joe, but, I would rather just vote for Trump because I don't want Biden to get in. Look, I get it. I understand. But the good news for any Trump voter really is that the math on these polls does not make sense. When you look at their polling rationale, like what they do to pick who they ask, and then in addition to that, they do calculations on the back end to what they say they're ironing out any kind of like biases or kind of shortcomings in the poll. Well, one of the things that they do on the back end is they actually make an assumption based off of how many Republicans will actually vote for the Republican and how many Democrats will actually vote for the Democrat. And as you can imagine, it's swung in Biden's favor. Okay. They're assuming that 90% plus of Democrats will vote for Biden, and they're assuming that only about mid to high 70s will vote for Trump. And that's completely ridiculous. There's actually a number of polls that have come out recently that look at Trump's approval rating amongst likely Republican voters, and that approval rating goes anywhere from the high 80s into the mid 90s. All right, which means estimating that only 75% of Republicans are going to vote for Trump, I think is really skewing those poll numbers. The other thing to look at here is that the gap really looks a lot bigger because of that national polling skew. But even when you look at these swing states, the gaps are a lot smaller. They're a lot smaller than if you think that Biden across the board has a double-digit lead. And we'll actually dig into some of those, and you can see some of them on the screen. We'll pull them up in bigger fashion as we kind of go through each one of these swing states. All right. Trump has a 95% approval rating amongst Republicans. Like I said, his approval rating overall, on average, like across the board, is high 40s. All right. That's actually low compared to previous presidents that have been reelected, previous incumbent presidents that have been reelected. And that's both Republican and Democrat. Typically, they're anywhere in that like 50 to 54, 55 range. All right. Now, that being said, Trump also booked record votes in many of the states during the primary for the Republican nomination this go around for his reelection. Why is that important? Well, first of all, it was a no-brainer. He was obviously going to get the nomination, and those people didn't have to show up, and yet they did in record numbers. You're talking record numbers that rivaled and actually beat some of the Republican darlings as of late, Reagan included. All right, so it seems like Trump has a huge hold on his base. Okay, as much as you want to say whether he's true Republican or not a Republican, the Republicans are going to show up and vote for him. All right. The question then becomes, can he overcome, first of all, the fact that he's probably not going to trim a ton of Democrats because of how much, they're basically going to have a anti-Trump bias to them, and not necessarily a pro-Biden bias. And then also, what can he do with independents? Can he pull that independent number in his favor? We've actually never had a larger percentage, at least that I know of in modern history. We've never had a larger percentage of eligible voters unaffiliated, or basically independents out there with their votes kind of like up for grabs. All right. Here's something else. Something else I'm going to talk about: Blacks and Latinos. So I'm obviously not within either one of these demographic groups, so I can't necessarily talk from personal experience. But I can say that both of these groups, I think, are extremely underestimated in terms of how they will end up helping Trump. And I'm going to have to say that again: how they will end up helping Trump. All right. So first of all, let's take Latinos first. A lot of what I've read leading up with the early voting, the mail-in voting, and everything like that has led me to believe that Democrats are actually disappointed with the Latino turnout. So if they don't turn out today, that's a big problem. They've obviously pushed that xenophobic button. They've basically, doubled down on the kids in cages and the splitting families and things like that. And again, I'm not talking policy today. I'm not talking about whether those good things or not. I'm talking, purely about the campaigns, the rhetoric, and everything like that. They've doubled down on those talking points. I think what happened was when Trump was not a politician, when he was running as just a crazy business guy who just by happenstance got the Republican nomination, I think you had a ton of people who were easily swayed when the media or one of the Democrats or even his own Republican Party, were painting him as a racist or a xenophobe. It was a little bit easier to paint him with that brush and accept that definition because he was an unknown quantity. So you had no idea, right? And so your default might have been that, all right, well, if someone says it's true or a bunch of people say it's true, it must be true, right? Well, there's been 4 years since he was elected. And again, not talking about whether waned a little bit on Trump. And the same thing with the racist tag. I think he's shown that he might be in favor of policies where, Latinos or undocumented immigrants are basically at the focal point of those policies. But I think he's also shown, same thing with Black Americans, but I think he's also shown that it's not the race piece that's motivating what he's doing. I think he honestly believes that he's putting in place good policies for America. That being said, I don't necessarily agree with him, but, I think what's proven out, or at least within these communities, is that a lot of them have seen that he's not necessarily making these decisions or pushing these programs or these changes because people are of a certain cultural descent, because people are from a certain, cultural heritage or background. I think they're seeing that, he is pushing these things because he believes they're good ideas, and that or that they're pro-American ideas, and that it's not necessarily some inherent kind of KKK-esque or overtly racist or xenophobic bias that's causing him to push these things. All right. So that being said, I think that plays a little bit of defense in terms of Latino voters. Now, put that onto the, put that into the vein of looking at Black voters in the United States. And I actually think that there is a surprise coming. I think when they do the exit polling from this election, I think you're going to see a louder Black conservative voice than you've ever heard at any time since basically the late 1930s. Okay, I think the Black conservative voice is on the rise, and I think that might actually be able to push him over the finish line. And we'll talk a little bit more about the mechanics of that in a bit. The independent or unaffiliated voter is a wild card here. The one thing I'm going to say is it starts with a question, right? What really inspires the independent voter? If you're not adamantly on the red or the blue side, right? You're a free agent. What motivates your decision-making process, right? Are you motivated by what has happened with BLM and the social activism and the riots and everything like that that's associated with that? Are you motivated by COVID and the response, or maybe the perceived lack of a response out of the president's administration? Are you motivated by the economy and your concern for your job or your business and your income? I've always had an assumption or a conclusion that I've held pretty, in light of not knowing what the certainty is. Most people will err on the side of their job. They'll err on the side of their income and taking care of their family. And so for that point, I actually think that independent voters, Trump will hold a slight edge. I don't know if it's going to be an astronomical edge. I think he'll hold a slight edge in terms of those independent and unaffiliated voters because of that jobs and economics angle. Again, we're not talking about actual policy. I think both candidates, regardless of either one, which one gets elected, they're going to print money. There's going to be stimulus in the first quarter of 2021. There's going to be deficit spending. No one's sitting here talking about, getting the budget in order and fixing the national deficit or the national debt. So I think the economy is going to be fine regardless, because they're going to continue to pump steroids into it and try and make it a winner to show how great either one of them is on the economy. That being said, I think that voters who are voting based off of their job and their concern for having a job or keeping their business open and viable, I think they're going to, lean to the side with Trump. There are going to be record vote totals because of a couple of dynamics. First of all is the mail-in ballots. You've basically greased or lowered the friction point of voting. Okay, so mail-in ballots make this a very easy fill in the circle, put it in the envelope, and stick it in the mailbox or stick it in the ballot box. It makes it very easy to vote, and so I think you're going to see record numbers because of that. The other dynamic is just how polarizing Trump is, right? And I'll draw an analogy here. It's the Howard Stern analogy from, if anyone's ever watched the movie, or I think he also wrote the book called Private Parts. When they're talking about why he's so popular, half of people would tune in to Howard Stern to listen to what he had to say because they loved what he had to say. The other half of people hated him and tuned in to see what he had to say because they wanted to complain and scream and yell about it and rage about it. Okay. I think that dynamic means because Trump is involved in this race, that's another reason why you're going to have record voter turnout, right? Again, really adamant people that are pro-Trump and would lay down in traffic for him. And then you have very adamant anti-Trump people that for the most part are voting Biden mostly because he's not Trump. Okay. That's another dynamic that's also playing out in this election. More than half of voters who are likely Biden voters or Democrats basically say they're voting for Biden, more than half of them, because it's more an anti-Trump vote than it is a pro-Biden vote. That means less than half of Biden voters will actually be pro-Biden voters. They're more anti-Trump voters. Whereas if you flip that and ask Trump voters, likely Trump voters and Republicans, like 86% of them say that they're voting for Trump. And only about 14% are saying they're voting for him because he's not Biden and because they don't want socialism or what they think is going to come from a Biden administration. All right. So remember that polarizing aspect of it is really important when we kind of get into these things. All right. More on the backdrop. If the election was held in 2019, I think Trump wins easily, right? The economy's cruising. There's no COVID. The George Floyd situation has not happened. All right. I think if this thing is held in the end of 2019, Trump cruises. I think there's not even a chance. He probably increases electoral vote count from the prior election. Okay. But because it's 2020, because it's COVID, because it's the racial equality and equity issues that we're dealing with right now, all of that, the mail-in ballots, all of it means that now it's a little bit, probably a lot more of an uphill battle for Trump. I would actually make the argument that he is probably the incumbent president that is facing one of the hardest roads to re-election than most of the other incumbents that have tried and failed or tried and won with very kind of adverse situation happening around their. All right. Incumbents have a hard time winning when there's adversity, right? It arises. If it worsens during their first term. Now, here's the wild card. It really worsened within the last, 25%, the last year of a 4-year term. And Trump hasn't necessarily seen this kind of slow erosion over 3 years. So I think his campaign has really tried to focus on that. This is a near-term blip. We're going to get past it, right? How much that sticks to him is going to be a huge determinant of whether or not he's able to get reelected. And like I said, incumbents that typically have that dynamic have a very hard time getting reelected, where, if things got worse. Now, there are a ton of polls that basically say over half of people think that, as compared to 4 years ago, even in light of COVID, their lives are better. That works in his favor. I don't know. We'll see. Those are competing narratives. There's also some really oddball indicators being thrown around out there in terms of, everyone has a prognostication. They all use a matrix and things like that. I'm simply going to dig into the numbers. I'm a math and science nerd at the core of me. I'm going to dig into the numbers and try and give you a pretty analytical idea of where I think this is going. Something also to be said about mail-in voting. Some results are going to be delayed, obviously, like Pennsylvania, which is one of the first states we're going to talk about in terms of being a swing state. I'm not sure we know the results there until at earliest the end of the week. All right. But so now the mail-in voting is supposed to favor Democrats in terms of a 2-to-1 margin at the beginning. Right. So Biden is supposed to have a lead going into tonight. I don't think that's actually true. Not in the swing states. Again, that 2-to-1 margin, it holds if you look nationally in terms of the number of mail-in ballots that have been requested by Democrats versus Republicans. It holds nationally. All right. The problem is, again, you're skewing it with big urban centers that aren't necessarily swing states. Okay. Or in swing states. Now, will that also help in the end? Well, we're going to look at how many mail-in ballots have been requested and how many of them have been returned. Because if there's a lot that aren't accounted for, that's a wild card. That could swing states that we think went for Trump tonight and go back to Biden because they count these late arriving ballots. Again, we're going to have to look at the numbers on that. All right. And then Republicans are hoping for a surge of in-person voting. I got to tell you, I think it's happening. I'm just anecdotally, from what I've heard, what I've seen, what I've watched online, all the live feeds that I've seen, I think it's happening. The question is it going to be a big enough surge in order to counteract any of the Democrats that are going to brave, the prospect of COVID to show up and vote in person? That is a big if. All right. Here's part of the reason why kind of like polls break down and why this is such a strange election, like 2.0. All right. Trump isn't a traditional candidate. Now, that being said, Trump 4 years ago was an outsider. Trump now, as the incumbent president of the United States, is a politician. Okay. Completely different. He's almost a completely different candidate in terms of campaigning. All right. So Trump, the way he campaigned in 2016, if he tried to do it again this year, that wouldn't work. Okay. He's using some of the tried and true stuff from 2016, but there's also a lot that he's using that he normally wouldn't have been able to do in 2016 that he's now doing in 2020. All right. And that's part of the reason why the polls don't work very well in terms of Trump, because he's not a traditional establishment politician. All right. Trump's trying to throw in roadblocks. He's trying to head off some of these things at the past. Like I said, with the Latino voters, he's trying to head it off so that they either don't show up, or if they do show up, he's able to trim enough votes in order to neutralize any kind of uptick in how many of the Latino voters show up. All right. He's been able to pull huge rallies in the day and time of Corona. Huge rallies. Butler, PA, what was it, 2 days ago? 57,000 people in person at a rally in the day and age of Corona. That's incredible. And you cannot bat an eyelash at that. That is not paid attendees. That is people that spent their time to show up and, like I said, braved a potential pandemic in order to show up and go to a rally for Trump. And then the last thing is he actually has a rally cry, right? His rally cry is, this freak accident came along in the form of COVID. We need to rebuild. We need to do things like we were doing a year and a half ago. And you saw I had success. I'm going to be able to do it again, right? There's no real rally cry on the Biden side. The Biden camp is really kind of talking about how Trump screwed up and how, if it was someone else, especially if it was Hillary, these things wouldn't have happened. Now you need Biden to fix the problems that he created. Okay. That's not really a rally cry. That's more of like, again, an anti-Trump push as opposed to a pro-Biden push. All right. Speaking about that difference between 16 and 20, all right, Trump's team committed in a big way to a ground game. What held the Democrats back and Biden's team back was they couldn't commit hardcore to a ground game because they wanted to die on the cross of Corona, okay? That you needed to be socially distanced, and he wanted drive-in rallies, not in-person attendee rallies and things like that. Well, the Republicans and Trump's campaign pushed past that, and they were like, you know what? We're going to need a ground game in order to be able to win this thing. And so that's a big difference between 16 and 20. If you remember in 2016, Trump was very much a TV politician. He was very much a social media politician. Okay. What was the name of the firm? Cambridge Analytica, right? That really tried to take those fringe voters and show them social media content to push them over the edge and get them to vote for Trump, right? That's how he got those independents. That's how he got those undecided voters. This go around, it hasn't been like that. It's been more like a traditional politician's campaign, even in light of COVID. Like, believe it or not, in light of COVID or irrespective of COVID, it's been more of a traditional ground game that he's using. Let's see. The other thing is the candidate messaging. So Trump's he's trying to run on continued success. Again, with that asterisk that the last, 6-12 months has been a blip. It was a freak accident, and we're going to go right back to where we were, right? He focuses on the economic numbers that look really good. The only reason why they look good is because they were so bad for months beforehand. But that's what he's focusing on. Biden's trying to run, again, on Trump failure, right? Trump being outlandish, uncalculated, unhinged, too emotional or too cocky of a leader, and not someone who is empathetic and calculating and things like that. All right. Again, the big issues are going to be COVID, the economy, racial equality, and I think to a certain extent the Supreme Court, but that's pretty much died down, at least in the interim. All right. So let's start to look at some numbers. All right. So polls, we're going to look at early totals, the better trends. Polls are better for trends than they are the absolute number. Like I said, these polls all have stuff on the back end of them that correct for bias and correct for sampling issues. You can screw up the number completely if you correct incorrectly. Okay. You can come up with completely bogus numbers. What's important is the trend. Are both lines pretty much staying the same? Is one candidate rising, one falling? That is what you want to pay attention to, not exactly the absolute numbers. All right. Something also to keep in mind, some basic numbers. This was as of maybe less than a week ago. 33 million people had voted in person. I think these numbers have gone up. 33 million voted in person already, early voting. 57.6 million mailed in their votes. And that is juxtaposed to 139 million total votes in 2016. So that means mail-ins and in-person early voting is basically in between 90 and 100 million votes, and 139 total voted in 2016. That means that we only need 39 million people or 40 million people to show up today to vote to break 2016's numbers. We are going to see record turnout. It's going to happen. Like I said, mail-in balloting and early voting completely removed a lot of the friction and the excuse for not voting, right? So a lot of more people are going to vote, and we're going to see how that works in one of these candidates' favor, or both of them in some cases. So here we go. All right. So we're looking at what you see on the screen right now. This is from The Guardian. This is a rolling average 14-day average of polls in these swing states. All right. So they're taking everyone else's polls, they're averaging them together in order to come to some kind of semblance of like a consensus number. All right. I've also pulled information from the New York Times in terms of the early voting, mail-in registrations and return ballots numbers. I looked at the Pew Forum for basically party affiliation numbers to see whether or not there's big disparities there. And then also I will show you my electoral college map once we go through this analysis. Before we start talking about individual states, there's a couple of assumptions that went into my analysis here. Democrats and Republicans will, for the most part, vote for Democrats and Republicans, all right, with some small differences at the periphery, and we'll talk about those. Higher voter turnout helps candidates that the voters are voting for, meaning if tons of people show up, I highly doubt that the anti-Trump compulsion will cause tons of people to show up at the polls. Remember, you had surges in voting from certain key demographic groups when Obama ran for re-election. Why? Because they were voting for him, not anti-McCain or anti-Romney. Okay? They were voting for him. So remember that. Part of the reason why Hillary lost in 2016, there weren't a ton of people that were voting for Hillary. There were a lot of women that were voting for Hillary, but a lot of people were voting for Hillary because she wasn't that, god-awful monster that she was running against. All right. That doesn't compel people to go to the polls. What compels people to go to the polls is a rallying cry. All right. Mail-in request ratio needs to be, for the early voting, needs to be 2-1 to help Biden out, because the assumption is that Democrats are not, maybe not all of them are deathly afraid, but more on average than Republicans are afraid of showing up to some big group gathering, meaning a polling station, in order to vote in person. So they need that lead in the mail-in ballots, all right? And again, the national rate doesn't matter because it's skewed by a handful of places that are probably going to vote for Biden no matter what. So we can't look at that, all right? The lower percentage of mail-in ballots requested helps Trump. So if less than 50% of the total eligible voters in a state ask for mail-in ballots, that helps Trump because, again, we're assuming that in-person voting is going to drastically favor the Republicans, who are not that concerned with Corona, in order to be able to show up and vote for Trump, okay? If most mail-in ballots are returned, it helps the party who requested the most. This just kind of makes sense, because remember, just because you request a mail-in ballot or you received one doesn't mean that you were going to return it, okay? There's also tons of mail-in ballots that went out, and maybe they didn't find the person who is actually going to, use it. It might have been improperly addressed, or the person might have requested it and just been like, you know what, I really don't care, or lost it. And they were like, look, I don't think either one of these people will speak for me. I'm really not going to vote for them. So that's an entire, I think that's kind of a no-brainer. If most of the mail-in ballots are returned, it helps whatever party requested most of the mail-in ballots to begin with. All right. So let's start talking about some specific states. Florida right now. Again, this is the Guardian. The 14-day rolling average shows Biden plus 2.2. Again, I think these were updated overnight, so these are fairly recent. Plus 2.2, okay? But if you notice, again, we're not talking about absolute numbers. Trump has made up ground within the last month, all right? This is a significant jump. He's jumped a handful of a percent within the last month in Florida. So he's either closing the gap, or if these numbers are not accurate, he could be leading or extending his lead, all right? Remember that. If the numbers aren't accurate, we're looking at trend. He is on the uptrend. Biden has been pretty much flat over the last month, all right? Now, also think about this. I didn't pull these up. I have the numbers here, but for a couple of these, Trafalgar was a polling group that was one of only two, I believe, that said that Trump was going to win in 2016. And they have a pretty different mechanism by which they pick votes, potential voters, or kind of poll the voting populace to figure out who's doing well or who's getting voted for in a given state. And so Trafalgar actually shows Trump in Florida plus 2.1. So there's a 4.3 spread just between Trafalgar and this kind of 14-day running average of polls. So that just goes to show you that this is even closer than you think. And assume it is 2.1, Trump could be running away with this one. All right. Now, some quick numbers in terms of the total votes. 8.3 million of 14 million registered voters have already voted. That's almost 60% of people in Florida have already voted. All right. So again, that's over 50%. We're going to look at the total number of requested ballots. A lot of people have voted in person in Florida as well. So you've got to remember that. But that 59% number means that the Democrats need they should have a big lead in terms of requested ballots versus what's been returned and already logged as votes. Okay. In 2016, 74% of the eligible voters in Florida voted. Pretty good number. We are going to eclipse that. Okay. We're going to eclipse that. You're going to see more than 74% of the eligible voters of that 14 million number will vote in 2020. All right. 31% of the total votes that have been logged, I'm sorry, 31 of the eligible voters in Florida have returned their ballot. And that is compared to 42% that requested that one. Again, if that difference is small, that helps whoever requested the most. Well, that 11% difference isn't that great, right? It's not that great because those people that requested those ballots are in danger of not being able to get them in time or just not returning them in general. Now, looking at the total number of ballot requests, 45% of the ballot requests are Democrat, right? That's a big number. But guess what? 31% are Republican. That means that there's not a 2-to-1 margin there. It's like 1.5 to 1. All right. So that's below that 2x, 2-time margin. And Democrats are they're requesting ballots in proportion to the overall party affiliation within Florida. That's not good for them either. So just for instance, 45% of that 14 million in Florida are Democrats, registered Democrats. Well, 45% are requesting mail-in ballots. That's not good. They need outsized. They need to be over their 45% because they probably won't get 45% of people showing up to the polls as registered Democrats. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, record turnout. I think it's because Trump's there. It's also his home state now anyway. Let's see. 42% mail-in request is low. So the total number of voters that requested a ballot is 42%. That's under that 50% margin. That helps Trump. 11% margin of requested versus return. Again, we said that's double digits. That does not help the party that requested the most. And again, that is the Democrats in this case. I am calling Florida for Trump. The low polling difference, Trump is surging in the polls, regardless of which one you look at, and voting is working to his benefit. Okay. All right. Now let's push over to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, 14-day rolling average, 5% difference. Biden has a 5% lead in PA. These first two states, Florida and Pennsylvania, if Trump doesn't carry both of these, he is in big trouble. Big trouble. He can almost not make it to 270 if he doesn't carry one of these. Both Florida and Pennsylvania. It becomes a very tough, almost impossible uphill climb if he doesn't carry both of these states. All right. Biden is +5. Trump is rising as of late. If you look at the graph, Biden is rising slightly. Trump is also rising. He's rising a little bit faster than Biden. Here's something to think about in Pennsylvania. Right now, there's actually a pretty small percentage that have already voted. 2.37 million of 8.9 million registered voters. I don't know if you're going to see record voter turnout in Pennsylvania. You may, but I think that the closer we get to the record, it helps the Republicans again because it's going to have to be in person. Only 2.37 million of 8.9 million registered voters have voted as of right now. All right. In 2016, they had a relatively low number. 71% of eligible voters voted. Part of that dynamic is because Pennsylvania is dominated by Philly and it's dominated by Pittsburgh and Harrisburg out in the West. All right. So those cities pretty much dominate it, which means you probably have lower voter turnout because, one, if you're in the burbs, you probably feel like, or you're out in the midsection of the state, you probably feel like you can't overcome that, all right? And the second piece of it is, if you are a potential Trump voter in 2016, he might not have completely compelled you to vote for him, right? You might have been still sitting on the fence on election night, and hell, maybe you voted for Gary Johnson or someone, okay? Or just didn't vote because you were worried that he was just, again, a crackpot, multi-hundred millionaire or billionaire from New York, and you didn't even really think he was going to be a credible, viable candidate, all right? So only 71% of eligible voters voted in 16. Now, of the total eligible voters, 34% requested a ballot, 26 have returned it. So again, that margin's under 10%. So there's only an 8% margin there. So that's actually in favor of the party that requested the most, all right? But remember, it's in favor of the party that requested the most, but only 34% requesting ballots is not a very high percentage. That means 2/3 of eligible voters in Pennsylvania did not request a ballot. That works in Trump's favor, because tonight I would expect more Republicans to show up in Pennsylvania than Democrats to vote in person because of that COVID dynamic. All right. Now, again, Democrats got their 2-1 in the mail-in ballots requested. Democrats are at 63%. Republicans are at 25%. Okay. Democrats are actually outpacing party affiliation in terms of how many people asked for mail-in ballots. But what they don't have is 50% or more of eligible voters requesting mail-in ballots. So those mail-in ballots, though they're going to dominate early in those, may be very small compared to the total number of in-person ballots being submitted. There might not be a record turnout, which could help Biden. But again, I think if we get anywhere close to record turnout, it's going to be because Republicans are surging in the state. And I think the Butler, PA rally shows that could possibly happen. All right. Ballot request margin, again, 2.0, but it's not as good of a result for the Democrats. 34% of mail-in ballots requested is low. That works for Trump. There's an 8% margin requested, and that actually works for Trump in this case because of how low the total percentage of mail-in ballots are being requested. I am calling this for Trump. Biden could hold on to that lead if the in-person voting surge doesn't happen. But remember, Trump has held mega rallies in PA. He's gotten a ridiculous number of people to come out. Those people in the midsection of the state, most years, that feel like they were disenfranchised because 2 or 3 cities dominate that state, feel empowered to vote this year. All right. Pennsylvania should probably go for Trump this go around. It could be extremely close. Again, PA, we might not know until the end of the week or next week who actually won. And again, all of those factors, a couple of them work for Biden. So it's still something to watch out for. If he doesn't carry PA, Trump's dead in the water. All right. Ohio. This one, I think I can firmly call for Trump. All right. If you're looking at the Guardian rolling average, Trump is at 2 points and he's extending the lead. Again, the absolute number doesn't matter as much as the direction. Biden is relatively flatlined while Trump is on the upswing. I'm calling Ohio for Trump. I think this is a no-brainer. I think that dynamic where the Black conservative voter is being underestimated, the fact that the Latino voter isn't showing up as well as the Democrats had asked or wanted them to, I think is a huge dynamic here. Really quickly, because he has that lead, he's also had that lead in Ohio for like a month, right? So it's been tested over time. Again, mail-in ballots, only 38% of eligible voters requested mail-in ballots. And of the ones that have been requested, there's actually not a breakdown as far as Republicans or Democrats, but Republicans actually hold a small party affiliation advantage in the state. So I would assume that most all of these things work in Trump's favor. There's going to be record turnout here. And that I think pretty much puts Trump in the driver's seat in Ohio. So I'm calling those 18 electorals for Trump in Ohio. All right, let's push on to Michigan. So if I advance the screen here actually, you know what? We're going to sit with Michigan here in the bottom right-hand corner. Michigan right now is interesting. So Biden has an 8.6% gap. If you look at the Trafalgar survey or the Trafalgar poll, Trump leads by 1.5. That is a huge disparity. Michigan is a huge wild card right now. Trump has flatlined relatively as far as the Guardian polls, the moving average. And it actually looks like Biden's ticking up. But again, Trafalgar puts Trump up 1.5. So the question is whether or not, if Trump's already in the lead here, he has to hold on to it. If Trump's not in the lead, I don't think he can make it up unless, again, by some miracle, there's a gigantic surge in Michigan voters. I don't think he's focused enough on Michigan to get that to happen. Stranger things could happen, but some of the other numbers here, 7.9 million registered voters, about 2.5 have voted. So that's about a third of voters have voted. Again, not a huge amount, okay? But again, only 64% of eligible voters voted in 2016. Again, there's a large number of disenfranchised voters in Michigan. If he can mobilize them, that would be a huge boon to him in order to get that surge to overtake Biden's lead here. All right. 40% of eligible voters requested ballots. Again, that's still kind of low to help out the Democrats, but 32% have returned it. So it's still a decent gap there where it does kind of help Democrats. There's no data, but also Dems hold a pretty significant edge in party affiliation here in Michigan. It's possible there's going to be record turnout. Again, that's only if Trump can motivate a ton of Michigan voters to show up here. The ballot request margin, again, it's unknown, but it probably favors the Democrats. The 40% number is low in terms of the total mail-in ballots requested. So that does work in Trump's favor. And then the 6% margin or 6 to 8% margin of requested versus returned helps Biden. So I'm actually calling Michigan for Biden. That's 16 electoral votes that Biden is going to be able to carry in Michigan. All right, let's move on to North Carolina. So North Carolina, right now, Biden is showing a 1.6% lead. All right. If you notice the direction in the poll on the screen, North Carolina is showing a dramatic decrease in that lead over a very short period of time. Basically 3 weeks, Trump has made up the stagger. If you look at the Trafalgar poll, Trafalgar shows him up 2. All right. Again, this could be one of those cases where Trump isn't necessarily behind. He's extending his lead. Again, the absolute numbers mean nothing in polls. All right. It's the direction. So if Trump is ahead, he's extending his lead. If it's neck and neck, he's taking the lead. If he is slightly behind, he's in the process of overcoming Biden. There has been a huge turnout before Election Day. Over 60% of eligible voters have already voted. All right. That is compared to 68% of eligible voters in 2016. There is going to be a gigantic turnout in North Carolina. This is going to be a huge record turnout that works for Trump. Okay. Requested ballots, 20% of the eligible voters requested mail-in ballots. That is a paltry number, and that works dramatically in the favor of Trump. The ballot request is outsized, but again, that 2-to-1 margin of Democrats asking for mail-in ballots to the Republicans, it only works in their favor if it's 40, 50% of eligible voters requesting ballots. That is such a small number, 20% of requested mail-in ballots, that I think North Carolina goes in favor of Trump in a big way. Calling for Trump on that one, that's 15 electorals. Again, low polling average difference. He's been closing or maybe even making up the stagger and beating Biden. Record turnout, very low mail-in ballot request percentage. All right, Arizona. This is one of the ones that I think a lot of Democrats are hoping they're going to be able to flip. Look at the survey. Look at the poll. All right. Again, Biden is flat. Trump is rising. And Trump has been rising since September. All right. That is a dramatic increase off of the lows of September. He has been rising over the last 2 months. Okay. That's huge. Remember, August, July, July, August, September, that's kind of the time period where lockdowns lightened up and things like that. And all of a sudden we started having a little bit more activity. It's also the time period where people started to get really sick and tired of lockdowns and all of the COVID kind of like, the authoritarian measures that were being in place in a number of different states. Arizona, the Trafalgar poll shows Trump plus 2.3. All right. We're looking at the 14-day average of all these other polls, and it says Biden up 2.5. Trafalgar says Trump's up 2.5 or almost 2.5. All right. Again, he could be extending his lead here if he's actually in the lead, and the direction is all in his favor. Almost 60% of eligible voters have voted in Arizona. Again, huge number. In 2016, 74% of eligible voters voted. We're going to beat that number. There's going to be record turnout in Arizona. Again, works in Trump's favor. 57% of the 84%. So 84% of the electorate requested mail-in ballots in Arizona. That is a gigantic number, okay? Which you would think works for the Democrats. But check this out. Republicans actually beat Democrats in terms of the percentage of those ballots that were requested by Republicans. All right. One thing to notice here is, so obviously they don't have that 2-to-1 margin. Another thing to mention here, though, is that 29% of those mail-in ballots were requested by independents, by unaffiliated voters. So that is a huge wild card here. All right. Record turnout's going to help Trump. The ballot request margin is it's pretty much even, so that helps Trump. And 84% mail-in request is huge for the Republicans because they're outpacing the Democrats in mail-in ballots that have been requested. And then there's a huge difference in terms of the total number of ballots that have been requested versus the ones that have been returned. So that could help Biden, but you also have to remember, if someone requests a ballot, they don't have to send in that ballot to vote. They can show up in person and vote, and not send in the ballot, and that's their vote. So remember that. I'm calling for Trump to win Arizona. That's 11 electorals in his column. And again, low polling difference. He's closing fast or extending his lead. Record turnout, huge mail-in request, which works for the Republicans because they went neck and neck with the Democrats requesting ballots. All right, last two. Wisconsin. Wisconsin's a big one, all right? This has been an obvious focus of what has happened with Kenosha, the shooting that happened in Kenosha, some of the civil unrest and the protests and the riots that have happened in Kenosha. Wisconsin has been an epicenter of the racial, equality and equity issues as of late. Biden right now is showing a 7.4% gap on this rolling average. I do not have the Trafalgar number. I think it's a little bit better, but I think Biden is still ahead. That obviously works for him in his favor. Trump has been rising, but so has Biden. So that gap has stayed pretty much consistent. All right. 1.85 million of 3.6 million registered voters. That's basically half of registered voters have voted. All right. That half of registered voters voting breaks down to we could end up with record vote counts. Remember that Wisconsin actually turns out for elections. In 2016, Wisconsin had 83% of eligible voters show up. So we could still have a record, but again, it's not going to be a record in terms of what happened in 2016. We might just, kind of break the record in Wisconsin. One thing to note is 39% of the total registered voters requested ballots and 34% of them returned them. So that's, very small margin. So a lot of people who requested the ballots have returned them. There's no breakdown in terms of party affiliation in Wisconsin. So remember, that is a little bit of a wild card. And so the turnout will probably help Trump. It did in 2016. It'll probably help him again this year. The ballot request margin, again, it's unknown, but Democrats are slightly in favor in terms of registered Democrats in Wisconsin. So keep that in mind. It probably helps them in terms of the mail-in. And then the 5% margin of what was requested versus returned in the mail-in ballots works for Democrats, assuming that they picked up more of those mail-in ballots than Republicans. This is going to be close. I think Wisconsin's going to be a close call. I'm actually calling it conservatively for Biden. But again, if Trump can get enough people to show up in Wisconsin, he can flip that or keep that in his column. All right. But so conservatively right now, because I don't have any other evidence, I'm keeping that 10 electoral vote, those 10 electoral votes in Biden's column. All right. The last one. This is kind of interesting. So Iowa is somewhat of a bellwether here. It's a bellwether, I think, in most elections. Iowa, when you look at this survey, when you look at these polls, Trump leads slightly, but it's basically a dead heat. Okay. And if you look, both Biden and Trump are also kind of mirroring each other in terms of how they're trending. All right. So this is a dead heat kind of state. About 43% of eligible voters have already voted. All right. Of the 2 million, it's about 890,000, give or take. 79% of the eligible voters voted in 2016. So we could get record turnout here. Again, at least, 40% of eligible voters have to show up today to vote in order to get record turnout. There is about 46% of eligible voters requested ballots, and 43% of them returned it. So that 43% of voters that have already voted, it's all mail-in ballots. It's not early in-person voting, all right? And that slightly favors the Democrats. Now, interestingly enough, the breakdown of Democrats to Republicans that requested ballots is 46 to 33. Again, that's not 2-1. It's 1.5 to 1. So that, again, is not that magic 2x number that the Democrats are expecting and need in order to be able to have a lead going into tonight and having some of those lower turnouts in-person voting. All right. So again, we don't know if there's going to be record turnout here. It could work for Trump if it does happen. The ballot request margin is low. Like we said, 46% mail-in ballots is close to half. So that works in Biden's favor. But again, he's not at that 2.0. Iowa's a little bit of a toss-up. Conservatively, I'm calling it for Biden. Okay. I know that's a little bit crazy concerning the fact that Trump is slightly in the lead in this 14-day average of polls, but I'm conservatively calling it for Biden because of that dynamic of the 43% of votes being mail-in ballots, and the Democrats do have, that 1.5, almost 2-1 margin in terms of requested ballots versus the Republicans. So I'm calling that for Biden. So if we go through all of those, we're basically looking in the swing states of 125 electoral votes that are up in those 8 swing states. 93 I'm calling for Trump and 32 for Biden. That's a plus 61 delta for Trump. All right. That's essentially a possibility of him winning election. All right. Now, before I get to kind of like the final scenarios of how tonight plays out, I just want to quickly talk about the Libertarian and the Green Party candidates. All right. The polarizing incumbent of Trump helps the Libertarians and the Green Party. Okay. The also kind of milquetoast Democrat that Biden is helps the Greens and it helps the Libertarians. Okay. Folks that want to vote for something and they don't like Biden or they don't like Trump will vote Libertarian. They will vote Green Party or maybe even some of the independents and other candidates that will be on the ballot. All right. So that polarizing incumbent of Trump also not being a staunch conservative, a lot of Republicans or libertarian-leaning Republicans are voting for Joe Jorgensen. All right, a number of right-leaning libertarians in swing states are voting for Trump out of fear of not wanting to get Biden. Okay, but I think net it actually helps libertarian votes and also the other third-party votes. Mail-in will also help. So again, limiting the amount of friction to vote helps third-party candidates because you are more inclined to put a vote in, even if you feel like that vote, air quotes, won't matter. Okay, you can still send that in with relative ease as opposed to getting up and waiting in line in a polling station to cast a vote that you think won't matter. All right. That will dramatically help the third party candidates. I really think that Joe gets at least close, if not breaches that 5%. I really want to see her breach that 5%. That is a game changer. Regardless of who wins the presidency in this election, if libertarians get over 5% and get matching funds and automatic ballot access, 2024 is a whole different ballgame. You're talking about some three-way races. So keep an eye on the libertarian total vote count. All right. So let's talk about the 5 scenarios. Before we get into it, if you're watching live, if you're watching this on record, again, please subscribe, hit the like button, share it, comment, retweet it. We definitely want to get these messages out to people, and I want to keep doing these so that we can bring the message of liberty and freedom to as many people as possible. All right, so let's get into it. 5 scenarios. All right. So I'm going to go with, let's go with the least likely to the most likely. All right. The electoral tie. All right. The electoral tie is 269 to 269. I think that electoral tie is very unlikely from happening. If it does happen, it benefits Trump and Pence for a multitude of reasons, but mostly because if there is a 269 to 269 tie, the House gets to vote, and it doesn't go on a popular House vote. It goes on a state-by-state vote. And in the House, Republicans actually have a higher number of states that are Republican majority. So if we have a 269-269 tie, Trump wins the presidency. The House will vote Trump in to be the president. Same thing with Pence. Pence, assuming 269-269 means that there wasn't enough of a Democrat surge in order to put Biden in definitively in the lead, which means they probably won't overtake the Senate. And if it comes down to 50-50, Pence gets to cast the deciding vote, and he'll vote for himself. Right. So the electoral tie works for the incumbents. All right. The next unlikely scenario is Biden wins by just a landslide. I really don't think that's likely. Look, Trump is polarizing. Okay. Which means at worst for Trump, I think it's a close race. Okay. The fact that he has such buy-in on the Republican side means that he has a strong base. And again, this isn't 100% true, but he's giving people someone to vote for as opposed to someone to vote against. Okay. Whereas Biden and Kamala are pretty much the anti-Trump ticket, right? You could just remove their names and just say, are you voting for Trump or are you voting anti-Trump? Okay, that's basically the dynamic here. I think it's unlikely that Biden wins in a landslide. All right. Again, Trump wins in a landslide. Small chance. All right. It's possible with just a huge surge of votes tonight that get him over the finish line. I really think that, again, Black and Latino voters that vote conservative this election will surprise people. I think that the silent majority of 2016 is not silent anymore. But what you do have is a handful of people that voted for Trump in 2016 that have buyer's remorse, that have been replaced by now a silent minority, or you can call them silent minorities, because they are members of the Black and Latino population within the United States, and they don't want to say they're voting for Trump in public. But they will when it comes down to it, whether it's in terms of the mail-in ballot or the in-person. Again, you're not talking about 40 or 50% of that demographic group, but you could be talking 20% plus. I think there would be a huge surprise when it comes to those Black and Latino voters and them showing up for Trump to vote for a Trump conservative, which is kind of a oxymoron, but voting for Trump, which I think a lot of people have kind of completely underestimated. All right, the 2 most likely scenarios is Biden wins by a narrow margin or Trump wins by a narrow margin. I think if Biden wins by a narrow margin, Trump and Biden will both try to invalidate as many of the mail-in ballots as possible. I think eventually Biden wins in that scenario. I think the same thing on the flip side holds if Trump wins in a narrow margin. Both Trump and Biden duke it out in the courts. They try to invalidate as many mail-in ballots, a la the hanging chads in Florida, and Trump probably wins in that scenario. I'm actually thinking that if this election drags out a handful of days, this civil war, this societal unrest or anarchy that people are expecting probably won't occur as bad as if we have a definitive winner tonight. Okay. If we have a definitive Trump victory tonight, you're going to have to watch out. There's going to be riots. There's going to be things like that. And police and National Guard are going to have to crack down. Okay. If it gets dragged out and there's a fight in the courts and things like that, I actually think it's less likely to have as severe of a backlash from that standpoint, because folks will be glued to the news cycle. And believe me, the newspapers and the media outlets are that would be their dream scenario, is if this thing spans out over a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks into December, because then they get to carry all that coverage for all that period of time. So believe me, that is something that they are, I think they are licking their chops if that actually happens. But I also think it helps in terms of diffusing some of the societal unrest that might happen if tonight there's some kind of Trump landslide or Trump surge that happens. All right. So that being said, let's look at my electoral map. I have Trump. Let me just pull up the right thing here. I have Trump at basically 273 electoral votes. All right. Based off of that analysis that I did, I have Trump at 273 electoral votes. It's essentially because he is, carrying Pennsylvania and Florida, and then a couple of those other states, North Carolina and Arizona. I think the one thing to look at here is there's a small chance, but it's entirely possible that Trump could landslide victory if the surge wins him Iowa, Wisconsin, and then Minnesota and Michigan are both in play. Again, the Michigan poll numbers would have to be stratospherically off for that to happen, okay? The Minnesota poll numbers, then we didn't really cover Minnesota, but Minnesota, there is an outside shot that he pulls Minnesota, okay? I actually posted the tweet earlier today. I didn't really get anyone who responded to it, but I think it's an interesting question. I think Kanye and a couple of the other, outside candidates in Minnesota have polled with some numbers that are in the 1, 2, 3, 4% range. That could put Minnesota in play, either blocking Trump out, or it could put him in play for Trump to win. All right. And again, Biden can win and actually has an easier path to victory if he's able to hold on to the Iron Range states, meaning Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan in that range. And then also, if he can trim PA or Florida, it's all downhill for Trump. I don't think he can win if he loses either PA or Florida. So that's something to keep in mind. I think something else to keep in mind here is that Trump has a very difficult path for victory, okay? If he can't get just a ridiculous number of people to show up today to the polls, it's going to be extremely difficult for him to get to 273. Biden has a little bit of an easier path because, again, all he has to do is win one of those kind of wild cards, whether it's PA, Florida. If he can flip Arizona, again, it falls in his neck of the woods. A little bit of a wild card. I don't think it matters that much, but it could matter if we come down to like a 268 to 270 kind of situation. Maine and Nebraska both split electoral votes, so you could have some interplay there. I'm assuming Maine goes completely for Trump. I'm assuming I'm assuming Maine goes completely for Biden. I'm assuming Nebraska goes completely for Trump just because of that offset. Again, one or two of those electorals could float back and forth and kind of play spoiler a little bit in this whole thing. But so anyway, that's how I see the election playing out. I am really excited to see what the popular vote looks like for Jo Jorgensen. I really want her to get to 5%. Obviously, I'm biased. I want the Libertarian Party to be a player at this time in 2 years, and then again in 4 years. And look, we've already got a lot of people don't understand this. We've already got like over 200 elected officials at local and state government positions throughout the country, okay, that are libertarians. People like Larry Sharpe in New York are working really hard to get as many libertarians into positions, regardless of what level of government it's on, to show that libertarian values work. They preserve freedom, they preserve liberty, and what they do is they stop the over excess or the intrusion that government creates into our lives that causes a lot of the problems that now we're looking to politicians. They cause the problem. Now we're looking for them to fix the problem. All right. That is basically Einstein's definition of insanity, right? It's doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Okay. So that being said, I'm really hopeful that Dr. Joe is able to get over 5% so that we can get this thing in motion for the next 2 and 4 years and really start kicking some butt. I think that Trump wins. Look, it could be a toss up either way. I think the most likely scenario is a slight Trump victory with, and I don't even know if it'll be a prolonged legal battle afterward. I think it'll be a legal battle of a week, a couple of weeks. Could be, 2 weeks enough to file a couple of cases and see how the preliminary cases are being treated by both sides. And if judges are throwing them out or siding with the party that is assumed to be the victor, it'll all go away pretty quick. So I'm hopeful for that. I am hopeful that our country can move past this. There was a fantastic live cast by Larry Sharpe yesterday saying that, you know what, tomorrow we all have to go to work. Tomorrow we all have to get the kids dressed and fed, and we have to get them, either on virtual school or get them to school. Okay, we have to live our lives tomorrow, and we live our lives in a world where it's all of us. It's not just us. We don't get to cut off our friends and our family and our neighbors and tell them that they should go somewhere else or never talk to me again. You're dead to me because of who you voted for. Look, reducing us just to our political views is dehumanizing. All right, it's dehumanizing. Don't fall victim to that trap. Whoever you want to vote for, vote for. Okay, but at the end of the day, do not assume that someone else is awful or disgusting or subhuman or a racist or a xenophobe or whatever, or a misogynist. Whatever label that you could put on that person, do not equate that person with their vote. That's not the way this works. Okay, that is not the way that any of this is meant to work. There's supposed to be a peaceful transition of power when it comes to votes, whether an incumbent gets voted out or there's an open election and someone new comes in. There's supposed to be a peaceful transfer of power, and we as American citizens have to be able to live with each other after campaigning and elections are done. We have to be able to be productive and work with each other collaboratively when everything is said and done. So please remember that. I have so much love for this country. I think we are able to do absolutely unbelievable, fantastic things. We will do unbelievable and fantastic things as a country into the future. And like I said, I love each other for being people and humans and unique and wonderful people. And whatever the results of this election, good luck to you. And I will see you again for another live next Tuesday